I want to deal with Farage's interview on Friday, but I also want to answer some questions. And this morning, Rishi Sunak has said that Farage was completely wrong and his comments only play into Putin's hands. And I think Sunak also has realized he needs to change the narrative of an unstoppable Farage machine. I don't think he's going to be able to do that. Sunak is not that powerful and is not... I think he's lost his script writers, and I think without his script he doesn't really know what he's doing. And Nick Robinson said to Farage last night that he is no longer the chat show host. He's the man who wants to be your Prime Minister. Hence the picture of Farage outside number 10 on the Reform UK manifesto, or what he calls the contract. But Sunak says that Farage's words were an appeasement of Putin, and that's dangerous for Britain's security. He's quite right. And Nick Robinson points out that Farage has a history of important judgments. Robinson presented it as judgments. He has a history, a record of important misjudgments, and he's too proud, too arrogant, too bullish to admit these, and he uses a sort of sleight of hand to draw focus, or he blames somebody else. His words embolden Putin, of course, and he says, Farage says that the activity of the EU and NATO was what led Putin to attack, to invade a sovereign country like Ukraine. I think he's absolutely wrong. I think it's true that Putin took advantage of EU disunity, and, for example, the Scottish independent referendum, that was a distraction too, to make his dive first into Crimea and then ultimately into Ukraine itself, when we're completely overwhelmed with Brexit, not only Britain, but Europe as well. The UK has pursued 10 years, 14 years of self-obsessed constitutional onanism, whether in Scotland or with our neighbours in Europe, our misjudgment about the war in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS, the problems in Syria. Some of these were valid concerns, but we were, because of our constitutional obsession, we were not able to use our foreign influence effectively because we were too self-obsessed at home. That I think is the point. We were less able to respond swiftly to what Putin was doing, swiftly and decisively to what Putin was doing to Russia's actions in Crimea, or rather I should say to the Kremlin's actions in Crimea, because there's a distinction between what Putin and the Kremlin were doing and what Russia was doing and what Russia has wanted. And a lot of the polemic and a lot of the propaganda that Putin has put out in the last few years has been to try to convince the Russian people that he is right. And that's not only propaganda, it's also suppression and censorship and terror, to cow the population into acquiescence. In addition, I think following the 2008 financial crisis, we were perhaps happier to accept Russian money, and all this contributed to the perception of distraction and delayed reaction, and it played directly into Putin's hands, as did Farage. Now, the right to speak out, because various people have mentioned this in the comments, the right to speak out is perfectly reasonable, but it is constrained by prudence, by power, and by influence. And Farage should be aware of that when he commands the responsibility that is demanded of him. So he's in a position of responsibility, and he should be acting in that way, that elevated position. And he doesn't. He acts as if he is just simply an observer making entertaining comments. He acts like a chat show host rather than a potential party leader or indeed a potential prime minister. So his earlier praise of Putin needs to be properly contextualized or revised, or he needs to distance himself from it. But he didn't. And nor did he explain why he claimed to admire Putin when he invaded Crimea, the timing. Farage's original words were in 2014, at exactly the same time as Putin grabbed Crimea. Now, Nick Robinson was not so sure of the precise chronology and was prepared to be swayed by Farage's deceit. Farage is wrong. I can clarify. Farage says that he made his comment about admiring Putin before Putin invaded Crimea. No, he didn't. He made his remark on the 31st of March 2014. Putin signed the treaty to formally annex Crimea on March the 18th, 2014, and the sham referendum took place on March the 16th, 2014. And I know this only too well because I remember in my university the map of Russia was redrawn on the walls. There was a relief map just outside the rector's office, and it was remade and repainted to embrace Crimea within a couple of days. So this whole debate that we saw last night suggests then, and continues now to suggest, that Farage has an ethical and a political blind spot when it comes to dates and chronology. Farage also has a diary blind spot. That is catastrophic. He also, incidentally, has a blind spot when it comes to admiring Liz Truss. Farage roared with laughter as if it's funny that our mortgages have gone up. The best Conservative budget since the 1980s, but that's for another day, I think. As for Putin, he could have modified his statement. He could have contextualized his error. He didn't. It was a consequence of EU and NATO expansion, but it wasn't. It was about seizing control after Yanukovych was pitched out and seizing control before Zelensky formally renounced the Minsk agreements. That's the real truth of Putin's invasion. Instead, Farage parroted a version of the Kremlin propaganda, Nick Robinson says he echoed Putin. He echoed Putin's words, which is fairly unforgivable in itself. But no, says Farage. EU and NATO expansion. Farage said it first. Putin was repeating Farage. It's the arrogance of the man. I've been saying this since 1990. So's he, says Nick Robinson with a giggle. We've provoked this war, says Farage. Of course, it's his fault. That's what he concedes. Of course, we provoked it, but it's his fault. Maybe. Then he misquotes George Robertson to back himself up. The whole of that sequence was the most outrageous and languid le jeu de main. Nimble deceit, like a magician, but deceit nevertheless. And by the way, I also admire Nigel Farage, just as I admire any magician and performer, but I fear him, and I fear his prominence, and that makes me anxious. That makes me want to mock him, much as I feared the prominence of Kwasi Kwarteng. Once again, this man, Nigel Farage, I don't think belongs in the House of Commons. I don't think he should be elected. I think he belongs in the music halls, doing slightly lewd jokes. I would enjoy that. I think Farage would be hilarious as a new version of the cheeky chappie, doing tricks, but not in the House of Commons. And yet I can see that he should be in the House of Lords. Absolutely. Out of harm's way, and available to answer questions, be held accountable for the damage that he's already done. Because the political world that we now live in is one that's been defined by Farage. And so we come back to the thing about whether or not somebody has a right to free speech. Yes, they do. But there's a difference between Joe Bloggs, who is tolerated for saying something as a demonstration of free speech, and you can't transfer that directly to Farage because Farage has a political platform. Farage has television cameras pointed at him. Farage has a political party and people who follow him. The conspiracy rubbish, when repeated by Farage, takes on a new meaning because it comes from him. As for this propaganda, which Tony Dick points out rather brilliantly. Tony Dick is such a good commentator on the sort of rubbish that I put out, and I read the things that he says. I know he doesn't agree with me, and I try occasionally to deal with some of the points, but there's not enough time in the day to deal with everything formally. This time, I think I'm going to see if I can try. So Tony Dick says, what about this idea that the US State Department was involved in the Ukraine in 2013 or 14, the Orange Revolution, all this sort of stuff? Why did Ukraine choose to oust its democratically elected government? Did Russia make a better offer to Ukraine than the EU? Is that the one the Ukraine accepted? And is that why that government had to be removed? Does the US have a history of forcing regime change on other countries? Yeah. Did the US recognize the new Ukrainian government suspiciously quickly? I don't think that really matters. Anyway, protests erupted over the then President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. Political pressure was applied, and fairly obviously in a pretty ham-fisted way by the Kremlin. And the protests culminated in Yanukovych fleeing the country in February 2014. Now, many Ukrainians thought that Yanukovych's departure was a necessary step to rid the country of corruption and move to closer integration with Europe. And the interim government and many protesters saw Yanukovych's departure as a result of his abandonment of his presidential duties and that they betrayed Ukrainian interests. Russia has consistently maintained that this was a coup d'etat orchestrated by the West, particularly the United States, to undermine Russian influence and expand NATO's presence. I think this is a misjudgment and a misreading of the situation. And I'm sure that Russia is right in saying that the United States and its allies provided support to the opposition, but I don't, and helped their progress to change the power dynamic in the country. But I certainly don't think it was part of some plan to destabilize the area in the back door of Russia. I simply think that's a wild piece of Kremlin propaganda that has no basis in fact. But so the US certainly took an interest in what was happening. There's leaked phone call between the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the US Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt, in which they discussed the composition of Ukraine's future government, and it's been cited as evidence of US involvement. This call included the infamous expression about what they wanted to do to the EU. F the EU. So, you know, so you can't have it both ways. You can't start saying it's all because of EU expansion and then say, oh, no, 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 it's all because of American involvement. You can't have both, because America is precisely saying, F the EU. There's also the fact that America provided financial support to civil society groups and opposition groups in Ukraine. And some people have said this contributed to unrest and eventual government change, but America provides financial support to civil society groups around the world, as does Britain. Is there much greater evidence of Russian involvement in Ukraine at the time? And the answer is yes. So following the ousting of Yanukovych, pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine had support from Russian paramilitaries. Now this far exceeds the financial support to civil society groups which America is supposed to have been encouraging. This is about Russian paramilitaries going into eastern Ukraine, declaring independence from Ukraine and fomenting revolt. And this led to the conflict that is now ongoing. And specifically people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, known until his death for his close ties to the Kremlin and his involvement with and taking over the Wagner Group and supporting these separatist movements. The Wagner Group was one of quite a number of private military companies which were believed to be operating in Ukraine with the tacit approval and support of the Russian government. Like the Vostok Battalion and then the Somalia Battalion later on, led by Mikhail Tolstych, the Ghost Battalion, led by Alexei Mozgovy until his assassination in 2015. This is about Russian volunteers working in Ukraine, receiving support from Russian private organizations. And it had a huge effect on the Luhansk region, Redut, ENOT as well as covert operations, and there's an organization called Spetsnaz GRU, which provided support for these units and for the separatist military units that then developed under their control. Then there's the various versions of the Don Cossacks, led by commanders such as Nikolai Kozitsyn, active in the conflict, later on active before the conflict, supporting separatist forces, participating in major battles once the conflict itself began, once the invasion of Ukraine began. And once the war was declared, there was also a thing called, there still is a thing called the Russian Orthodox Army. And these paramilitaries, I think, significantly more evidenced and active than any of the claims made by Russian propaganda. Satellite images, intercepted communications, the capture of Russian soldiers in Ukraine, all cited this evidence of the factional paramilitaries active in Ukraine from 2013 through to the present day. I've been going on too long. I'm going to stop. But I would happily come back to this and go through more of these points. But it simply is not true that that EU and NATO expansionist ideas were what provoked Putin. or that we are responsible for the war in Ukraine. The EU, anyway, is an organization which exists to promote peace. And because of the EU, the European continent has been at peace for 70-odd years. It's a peaceful organization. NATO is perhaps slightly different, but NATO is a defensive organization. The idea that either NATO or the EU are threatening Russia is conceptually a nonsense as well as practically a nonsense. And when placed in the context of all this paramilitary activity within a neighboring sovereign country by agents from Russia, I think it starts to look extraordinarily immature and silly to claim that the West is responsible for Putin's actions. Farage is a fool, but an extremely able fool and an extremely convincing fool. But he is a fool nevertheless, and he would be better off going back into the theatre. I would certainly pay tickets to watch him and listen to him. Don't know whether he can sing, but at least we could see him strut around properly in his correct context. And that's a world, incidentally, that I admire and that I've been in. I'm not dissing Farage for his theatrical potential. I'm encouraging him. As I say, this is a man whose performance I admire, but I fear him.